All right. Welcome to the second panel of the morning. And I would like to begin the panel with, in some ways, a deceptively simple question. Is the microphone working? Can you all hear me well?
This is a simple question.
That was an easy one to answer. Disarmingly simple question. So, what difference does STS make? This is a question which has animated many of the discussions of this conference so far. It's a question that this panel takes quite literally. And all of our panelists have described various roles for STS in studying and mapping the making and remaking of difference. In this complex field, difference itself becomes a generative space, not just a space of exclusion, but of inclusion, as our agent provocateur is so deftly illustrated. Indeed, it almost goes without saying that STS does not just invert relations between the social and the scientific. It doesn't just expose race, gender, disability, etc. as socially constructed, but as a series of continuously emerging epistemic forms, scientific social objects themselves being drawn continuously into formation. And in some sense, we know all of this. So our panel today is drawn from the bioscientific arena, where questions of difference so visibly allied between laboratories, people, and populations. But these questions of difference saturate the entire field of STS. To introduce myself, my name is Jeremy Greene. I'm on the faculty of the History of Science department here at Harvard. I'm also on the faculty of medicine and a practicing physician as well. My own work, and I think why I was chosen to chair the panel in Sheila's inscrutable wisdom, is on similarity, which in a sense is the same thing as studying difference. I've been mapping the controversies surrounding generic drugs as a space which is not itself reducible to science or politics or even political economy, but a generative space in which new sciences of similarity come into formation. Our panelists today have described many of the sciences of difference in turn, and I'll introduce them in sort of a reverse alphabetical order to end with our provocateur. Nelly Oudshoorn, no, not quite, Oudshoorn? Oudshoorn is a professor of technology dynamics and healthcare at the Department of Science, Technology, and Policy Studies at the University of Twente. That was
yes,
all right?
Great. He rehearsed it.
And Nelly's numerous publications, I really can't begin to list them right now. I can't even really list her books. But they focus around a common set of questions regarding the complexity of understanding the co-construction of users and technologies in the biosciences and in technological practices as something which is never merely a universal, but focuses on various kinds of difference. And her most recent book, The Male Pill, A Biography of Technology, perhaps one of the ones our audience will be most familiar with, just won the Rachel Carson Prize in 2005. Sherine Hamdy is a medical anthropologist and the Kutaiba Al-Ghahnim Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Brown University. Sherine's work has been situated at the intersection of contemporary Islamic thought regarding techno-scientific development, especially environmental health, biotechnology, reproduction, and particularly organ transplantation. And her book, which will be released in just a few short months, right?
They tell me.
Called Our Bodies Belong to God, Islam, Organ Transplants, and the Struggle for Human Dignity in Egypt. It will be published by the University of California Press this fall, and we are eagerly awaiting it. Steve Epstein is the professor of sociology and the John Schaefer Professor in the Humanities at Northwestern University. He directs the Science and Culture and Human Cultures program and the interdisciplinary graduate cluster in science studies. Most recently, his book, Inclusion, The Politics of Difference in Medical Research, received the Ludwig Fleck Prize from 4S. And so we have assembled quite a robust panel today to speak to difference, and specifically to speak to how STS configures difference differently. And with that, I will turn to our provocateur.
I'm going to do it from up here because I have some slides. Is this microphone here working? Yes, great. Excellent. Well, I thank you, Jeremy, and I'm also very much looking forward to Nelly's comments and Sherine's. I also want to thank Sheila Jasanoff for creating this space for us to come together to debate who we are and what we do and why we do it, topics about which I hope we don't come to agreement. You can see that I'm segueing into my assigned role as provocateur, about which I have some of the same ambivalent feelings that Kaushik expressed. When I was a child and I would deliberately annoy my sister in the back seat of the car, my parents would turn around and say to me, "Don't provoke your sister." So I'm not sure if they would approve of my role today, even if it does sound better in French. But having accepted this assignment to provoke my SDS brothers and sisters assembled here today and in virtual space on this topic of what Sheila has labeled STS on difference, I do want to start by saying a word about what that title phrase might and might not mean for my purposes, or the various things that it might mean. Within STS, there are, for example, lines of research concerned with figuring out just how we go about saying in practice that two things are dissimilar enough to be called different, or conversely just alike enough to be called the same. And Jeremy just located his current work in that tradition. That body of work definitely intersects in some important ways with what I'll actually be talking about today under the rubric of STS on difference, but it's not exactly my point of entry either. Alternatively, we might look at work like Mark Berg and Annemarie Moll's volume, Differences in Medicine, which displaces notions of singular sciences and unitary scientific objects and usefully calls attention to heterogeneity, multiplicity, and disunity. Such scholarship could also rightly be called STS on difference. And it has implications for what I'm going to discuss today, but it's not precisely what I have in mind either. But neither would I be satisfied with defining STS on difference in a purely pedestrian way by referencing the standard categories of US identity politics, categories like race, class, gender, and sexuality, and then asking about their implications for science and technology. And more profoundly, what I want to talk about today is that double-sided relationship to which Jeremy has already alluded. On the one hand, the influence of the politics that surround categories like race, class, gender, and sexuality on the organization and content of scientific work and technological products. And on the other hand, the role of technoscientific practices in transforming the accepted meanings and the ontological statuses of those very same categories and identities. For example, in my book, Inclusion, The Politics of Difference in Medical Research, and in this talk I'm really only going to gesture at my own work, I ask questions like, have women been underrepresented as research subjects in clinical trials? And how did activists change biomedical research practices and policies in order to test for ethnic differences in the effects of medications? But I also try to take up questions like, how are abstract dimensions of social hierarchy like race and sex operationalized in biomedicine and transformed into categorical variables? And how might current biomedical research practices and new inclusionary policies have the effect of changing what we imagine race and sex actually to be as biological and cultural entities that may be linked in various ways to health and to disease? And I'm going to argue that that exploration of this dialectical relationship between embodied identity categories and technoscientific processes and objects is the distinctive and important contribution of the work that I'll call STS on difference. While such scholarship has a long history, I think I can suggest some of the current vitality of this body of work by gesturing, just for example, at Michael Montoya's newly published book, Making the Mexican Diabetic, Rebecca Jordan Young's recently published book, Brainstorm, The Flaws in the Science of Sex Differences, Alondra Nelson's forthcoming Body and Soul, which examines the Black Panther Party's role as a health movement and challenger of expert views on the biology of race, Ann Pollack's soon-to-be-published book on the intersecting trajectories of race, pharmaceuticals, and cardiovascular disease, Duana Fulwiley's work on admixture technology and what she calls the biologistic construction of race, Tom Wade-Zunis's just published STHV article on the social construction of statistics on gay teen suicide, I should say the social life of statistics on gay teen suicide, and Jessica Martucci's recent article on risk calculations and the science of blood donation policy in relation to men who have sex with men. So in speaking of scholarship of this sort as representing STS on difference, I also want to underscore the point that in my own book I use difference largely as an actor's category, and juxtaposed it with other terms in common use in the health domain, like disparities and inequalities that have other political valences and implications. In fact, at one point I described an incident in 2003 when the original draft of a national healthcare disparities report was sanitized by officials working for Secretary of Health and Human Services Tommy Thompson, who deleted from this disparities report most instances of the word disparity, in many cases substituting the more bland term difference. So I think if we're going to talk about STS on difference, let's agree that we're automatically implying several other terms as well. We're talking about power, hierarchy, and inequality. We're talking about individual and collective identities as loci of experiences and bases of mobilization. And we're talking about the divergent social locations from which knowledge is produced and political claims are made. I want to quickly flag two other problems as well. First, it goes without saying that any list of categories of difference is necessarily incomplete, and that's certainly true of my discussion today. I'm indeed going to focus on categories like race, class, gender, and sexuality in STS scholarship. I'll leave it to Sherine to comment if she cares to on why discrete religious identities and differences have so little figured in STS accounts, despite, or is it perhaps because of, the long-standing preoccupation with the presumed tension between science and religion. Neither am I going to say anything here about national or other geographic differences, crucial topic discussed in various ways on other panels like the preceding. And then second, a danger with collapsing various distinct social statuses such as race, class, gender, and sexuality into an overarching category of difference is that we risk improperly commensurating these statuses and treating them as if they're really just multiple instances of some general phenomenon. To do so is not only to misunderstand the specificities of these statuses, but also to preclude the possibility of properly theorizing their intersections. Okay, so enough preamble. What difference has STS scholarship on difference made? Well, in my attempt to be provocative, I'm going to assert regrettably little. And in my attempt to be doubly provocative, I'm going to perform a type of STS analysis for which I am little known, a bibliometric analysis of journal publication practices. So I have two tables of data to present today. In my first analysis, I took two leading STS journals, Social Studies of Science, Science, Technology, and Human Values, and I searched for various word roots in the titles of their articles over the course of the journal's histories. By word roots, I just mean words beginning with particular letters. So when I searched for SEX star, the searches also retrieved sexual, sexuality, etc. I then reviewed the hits to eliminate those that were obviously irrelevant. For example, I didn't count articles about the arms race as examples of articles about race, nor did I count Harry Collins' follow-up to his classic Seven Sexes article about replication in science as being an article about sex. I also added up the results per journal to yield a total, in the process blatantly ignoring my own warnings about false commensuration, and eliminated the duplicates in cases where the same article title had more than one of these words, though there were quite few of those, which is an interesting point in itself. The results, as you can see, are underwhelming. No single term shows up in even 1% of the titles of articles that have appeared in Social Studies of Science, although gender comes close. And only two terms cross the 1% threshold in STHV. If we look at the row of totals, we might say that Social Studies of Science over the course of its storied history has been 97.7% suffused with sameness. And Science, Technology, and Human Values just a percentage point less so. Well, with past and present editors of these two journals sitting in the room today, I should acknowledge that my methodology is no doubt suspect on various grounds, but it's worth taking a look at this body of 92 articles for what we can glean about the concrete manifestations of STS on difference. In the case of gender, for example, only 3 of the Social Studies of Science articles date from before the year 2000. Most of these 14 articles in 3S take gender as an unproblematic category of analysis, as in women's work, gender equality versus hierarchy in the life sciences. None appears to investigate the scientific constitution of gendered bodies, the creation of gendered categories, or the gendering of technologies. By contrast, articles in STHV, which had a special issue on gender as early as 1988 and a special issue on feminism and constructivism in 1995, are more inclined to examine the co-construction of gender in technoscience, as suggested by titles like Do Artifacts Have Gender? And The Gender Development of Anti-Fertility Vaccines. Looking at related search terms like sex, femininity, and masculinity reveals a similar pattern of difference between the two journals, with STHV articles addressing such topics as the sexing of sex hormones, safer sex as a technology, quote, patriarchal machines and masculine embodiment, unquote, and so on. In the case of race, by contrast, quite little has appeared in STHV, and more work shows up in 3S, even if those 14 articles constitute 0.1% of its total publication history. 3S took up the race and IQ controversy back in 1976, and in recent years it's published a number of articles on the bioscientific construction of racial meanings and categories, including a special issue on that topic in 2008, edited by Joan Fujimura, Troy Duster, and Ramya Rajagopalan. Finally, I would note that both journals have had next to nothing to say about the category of social class in relation to science and technology. In the case of 3S, perhaps instructively, the only two such articles date from the 1980s. What about the broader influence of this body of work? Even if articles on difference constitute a negligible fraction of the total output of key STS journals, is it possible that such scholarship is having a transformative effect on scholars elsewhere who study topics like gender and race? Well, to consider this question, I flipped my analysis around. I looked at the presence of words like science and technology in the titles of articles published in two well-regarded interdisciplinary journals, Gender and Society and Ethnic and Racial Studies. The results, unfortunately, are roughly comparable in numerical terms, revealing minuscule representation of technoscientific topics in the pages of these fine journals. Gender and Society has paid attention to gender gaps in pay among scientists and to reproductive technologies. But with the exception of one recent article by Laura Carpenter and Monica Casper, it is published next to nothing from a constructivist STS perspective. What they have done is printed a whole bunch of book reviews over the years of some terrific books, including ones by Clark, Haraway, Harding, Mamo, Mackay, McNeil, Oudshoorn, Schiebinger, Strathern, and Tuana. This pattern is even more strongly evident in the case of racial and ethnic and racial studies. Nearly every article that has the word science or technology in the title is in fact a book review. Of course, it's wonderful that these books are getting the attention they deserve, yet I can't help but observe that in the pages of these journals, STS scholarship is effectively segregated and made to sit in the back of the book. So, is it worth bemoaning the fact that STS scholarship on difference represents just a trickle of work within the vast streams of scholarly publishing, both in the world of STS and in fields that STS might hope to influence? I would say, yeah, it is a problem, and I would argue for the important and distinctive contributions that such work can and should be making in both domains. Within STS, work on difference should be promoted not simply out of concern, however well motivated, for diversity of topics or perspectives, nor is fostering such work merely a good way of connecting up with important social issues, though now that I mention it, that does sound like a good thing. I would also emphasize the centrality of studies of difference to a whole range of STS concerns. Two of them I mentioned at the outset. Work that seeks to establish how determinations of sameness and difference are made in scientific and social practice, and work that seeks to demonstrate the multiplicity, heterogeneity, and disunity of knowledges and sciences. In addition, studies of difference are a fruitful way of investigating the topics of classification and standardization, as Bowker and Starr pointed out, as I tried to show in my own work. They're often closely connected to studies of lay knowledge, challenges to expertise, and the dynamics of participation. And they're a vital way of considering both what Joe Dumick called objective self-fashioning and what Ian Hacking called making up people, as Alondra Nelson has nicely demonstrated in her study of popular uses of genetic genealogy testing to establish African ancestry. I would likewise argue that STS work on difference can and should be making a powerful contribution outside of STS for the broader study of differences in relation to race, class, gender, and sexuality. Work on topics like how a lab sample becomes raced, or how a hormone becomes sexed, or how a technology becomes gendered, has enormous relevance for understanding issues of classification, embodiment, performance, and many other broad themes commonly invoked by scholars in fields like critical race studies and gender and sexuality studies. And I think that they ignore such scholarship at their peril. Work like Michelle Murphy's on the specific technologies that were used by activists in the feminist women's health movement recenters our understanding of feminist political engagement by placing technological innovation in the foreground. Work like Jenny Reardon's on the mechanisms by which genetically defined populations are called upon to speak in their own name as participants in genomics projects like the HapMap demonstrates that we simply can't understand the present-day workings of governance and democratic participation without analyzing the technoscientific processes by which new collective actors are called into being such that they can assent to their participation as research subjects. So in all these ways and more, STS work on difference is not an incidental contributor to our understandings of difference, identity, inequality, power, participation, and representation, but in fact, I think offers a range of distinctive and transformative contributions. So thank you. Look forward to comments from discussants and from the audience.
So which of you would like to go first, Nelly?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thanks Sheila for inviting me here. I think this is a wonderful conference in terms of all the time we have for discussion, so I enjoy it a lot. And I think it's very important for the field to have this space and to reflect on our past and to think about our future. And of course, thanks to Steve for his reflections, and maybe it's not such a surprise if I start by stating that I agree with most what Steve has said, but nevertheless I will try to go into some issues he raised and try to also introduce other kinds of conceptualizations of this field of difference, studies on difference. So, first of all, I want to talk about my own involvement with the theme of difference. Well, that's similar to Steve's, and can be summarized in terms of the co-construction of technoscience, bodies, and user identities. So a focus on the politics of difference was a major concern for two of my books. One on Beyond the Natural Body, that was addressing the sex and hormones, like Steve summarizes so nicely, and my book on the male pill. As Steve mentioned already, the co-construction approach to difference has been very productive in the past 20 years. And again, it won't be a surprise if I state that a focus on difference should remain a major concern and aspiration for STS in the next 20 years, because difference is an important organizing principle in society, where race, gender, class, sexuality function as social cultural categories of differentiation that shape and are shaped by governance structures, technoscientific practices, and daily life. So in my contribution to the discussion today, I want to continue Steve's reflection on the use of the term of difference. Through the years, scholars working on issues of difference struggled with two major problems. First, studies on gender and race, etc., ran the risk of reinforcing dominant discourses on difference and social stratification. The second problem is that a focus on difference might support processes of naturalization of social cultural categories of difference, a concern raised by Steve already. For example, in current debates in Europe, the term difference of subpopulations in nation states, when newcomers are increasingly portrayed as the other or as unwanted citizens. Here I refer, for example, to current debates in the Netherlands, where all of a sudden we talk about the Dutchness of citizens. That's a problem we face. Equally problematic, the term difference is very popular in recent debates on gender and race inequalities, where biological studies on the brain and genes are enrolled as major resources to argue for a biologically rooted difference. And here, of course, we see a revival of the nature-nurture debate of the 1970s, as if no one ever learned about all the studies STS has been doing in this area. Actually, I'm invited quite a lot to do similar debates as I did in the 1970s. So. Well, one way to tackle this problem of reinforcing dominant discourses on difference and processes of naturalization is by emphasizing that the term difference is an actor's category, as Steve suggested. This applies a reframing of research questions and approaches based on another vocabulary, so talking about inequalities, about hierarchy, about power, to open up the black box of how technoscience contributes to sustaining or challenging conventional categories of gender, race, sexuality, and class. I would like to suggest another additional strategy here we can use, namely by focusing not so much on difference, but on diversity. And then on diversity within social categories of difference. And of course, in STS, we know that words matter. Thus, it may be worthwhile to rethink our own vocabulary and talk about diversity rather than difference. There are two reasons for this. First, the term diversity does not have such strong connotations with biological discourses. At least in the European context, governmental policies and many social movements articulate their concerns for equality and inclusion in terms of diversity and not in terms of difference. Second, a focus on diversity enables us to study differences within a specific sociocultural category, which undermines processes of othering and naturalization. One way to do this, of course this is a question about method as well, is that we can adopt an intersectional approach. Now I talk not about intersexes, but about intersections developed in gender studies. Intersectional approaches are based on the assumption that socially and culturally constructed categories such as gender, race, class, and sexuality do not act independently of one another, but interact on multiple levels. Despite its success in feminist theory and in sociology in general, intersectional approaches have not been included in STS research, except for some post-colonial studies that focus on the intersections between gender and race, and some of the work Steve has been doing as well. So I would like to suggest that intersectionality provides an important heuristic tool for STS research in the next 20 years to study how various categories of difference are intertwined, how they are constructed, and what difference is prioritized or silenced in the construction of facts and artifacts. And I labeled this as the anti-categorical research agenda, and I want to end my presentation, my discussion, with two themes. Of course, this agenda could include many themes, but I will mention two of them. First, following the work of Joyce and Memo on what they call graying the cyborg, I suggest we should study age as well, taking this intersectional approach. Age, a category that Steve did not mention, age, a category that's only popping up only recently in some studies. And I think this is very relevant, again, if we look at the problems a lot of societies face in terms of aging society, which shows similar processes of othering and naturalization as happened to the other categories of difference. Secondly, an anti-categorical research agenda would also include, and that was the issue raised in the previous panel, a shift towards studying other locations, other spaces of production of knowledge. And not only saying, okay, all of a sudden we should study India instead of the US, but be aware there is much more going on. Also in terms of, and that was missing in the previous panel, I think, this whole body of literature and expertise that's coming up in the STS community in the East Asian countries. So I would like to end my discussion on reflection on the bibliometric exercise you did. I think if you would have included the East Asian Journal of Science Technology Studies, maybe it would have been a bit more higher scores in terms of gender and race there. So, thank you.
So I also want to thank Sheila for having the foresight to convene this conference and have us ask these questions about where we are and where we're going. And thanks to Steve for that provocation. I thought I would take a stab at the question that Steve pointed at me on science, religion, and difference. But I thought I'd ask a different one, not about STS accounts of people of religious difference, so what makes a Jew or a Muslim or different kind of person, but rather one about, and the reason I wouldn't ask that is because I think whereas racial difference, like Steve showed, has shuttled between the domains of biological expertise and sociological expertise, we generally tend to think of religious difference in terms of political science and history and sociology. But I wanted to provoke a different set of questions, and that is, why has there been so little STS engagement on how religious knowledge comes to understand sameness and difference? So it's not only categories of science that carry the most weight, and this is Suman and Kaushik have already pointed to kind of some of the Eurocentric limitations of STS models, and one of them is that in these elsewheres there are other rationalities, and I think we continue at our own risk to assume that science and religion are separate or even oppositional categories, because there are so many instances in which the one informs the other. And how can we move beyond the STS move of kind of unmasking or debunking the, here are the actual religious underpinnings of some practice that scientists only recognize as purely scientific, but actually to think about actors who very self-consciously integrate their scientific praxis and scientific understandings with their religious ones. So that really came up in my own work on Egypt and Muslim scientists and religious authorities working together. And I also think it's significant on this to note that the moral philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, who's been very influential for moral philosophy and religion, formulated his notion of what constitutes a religious tradition, and particularly some of the questions about religious reformulations in the contemporary era, while drawing heavily on ideas from the history and philosophy of science. So particularly he had read with enthusiasm Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos on the translatability and incommensurability of paradigms, in order to explain how different religious traditions could rival one another, or could become integrated, or defeat one another. And I think that I don't have the bibliometric evidence that Steve does, but it's my impression that STS at large has not really entered into using some of the same methodologies, looking at how religious practitioners or self-identified religious scholars integrate and understand scientific evidence and forms of reasoning as either different or similar to their own forms of reasoning. And I guess to answer Javier's question about, okay, but how do we get there? I'm proposing that we travel into more religious realms. I can offer from my own example, from my own research, that there has been too often this idea that fatwas, for example, are just an example of what Islam says about X, Y, and Z. So there might be a fatwa on organ transplantation being very commendable because you're generously offering something, and a conflicting fatwa that says, no, that's not up to you to give away part of your body. The body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to God. And this has too easily been read as either a conservative or a liberal reading, or a stringent, or having applied to different schools of Islamic legal theory. And in fact, I find that often what explains this difference in religious interpretation is the religious scholar's own understanding of the scientific cost and benefit analyses of the technologies themselves. So how have we completely missed that domain? I think we continue to neglect that at our own risk, because the more we exclude ourselves from forms of religious argumentation, the more we're ceding that territory to religious people who then become the only people who get to analyze or speak for themselves, right? And I guess the final question I had was about code switching, which Kaushik had brought up in the context of it being sort of a sophisticated marker of recognizing alternative epistemologies coexisting. And that made me think about how in the religious realm, code switching, and I'll give you the example from my work again of an Egyptian transplant surgeon who was so proud to have been the first surgeon to perform a kidney transplantation in Cairo in 1976, also simultaneously didn't like transplanting organs and thought that the body should only belong to God. And so why is that in some instances this kind of code switching is seen as a sophisticated appreciation, but when religion comes to bear on the problem, it's seen purely as hypocrisy. So can we stretch our analyses and reconsider the boundary between scientific and religious forms of reasoning to render these types of seeming contradictions understandable?
We have ample time for discussion. I'm going to stand to make sure I can see all the questions. I think we have 2 microphones. So I'd like to open this up to the audience. What? Yes.
Thank you for those. Again, another excellent panel. This morning's been so rich. I wanted to kind of bring those together a little bit in the sense that I think that in Sherine's comments, oh, sorry, I'm Ann Pollock from Georgia Tech. Sorry. I just wanted to bring up this issue that when we assume that religion is something that informs elsewhere, I think that we're failing to recognize. So not only the U.S. kind of broadly, but STS. So Nancy Shepherd Hughes is someone who's deeply influenced by liberation theology. Donna Haraway is someone who's deeply influenced by Irish Catholicism in youth or whatever, right? Those kinds of things. So we are failing to recognize those ways in which kind of religious traditions influence our own work as scholars. And we're also failing to recognize the way that I think this comes, brings Epstein's work and your work together in the sense that so many African-American health practitioners bring religion into their scientific work as well. And so, in kind of deciding that scientists here, scientists in America, in making that kind of implicit contrast, I think that we're failing to account for the situation on the ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And just to ask everyone to, even though we all know so many of each other, to identify yourselves, particularly for the people who are viewing from afar.
Hello? Yeah, I'm Mike Lynch. Happen to be editor of Social Studies of Science, so I thought I'd try to say something in response to Steve's analysis there that isn't defensive. I think it's very interesting, surprising to me. I'm not sure what it means, and I'd like to lay out a couple of possibilities and see what Steve makes of that. One is that there just isn't enough work being done in the constituencies that feed into these journals, and so that's why the numbers are low for both of them, and there's slight differences on different topics between them. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what it would take to demonstrate that. What would be a telling statistic, and I don't think it'd be easy to generate, would be that there's a lot of work that goes in the door of these journals and only a little bit that goes out with these words in the topic. I don't think that's the case, but I don't have, the statistics to back that up. So I think it's interesting. What I would like to know is if, since one thing, I think it's probably true for science, technology, and human values as well, is we don't do much to twist people's arms or to encourage people to submit. Mostly what we do is we react to what's submitted and enlist people like Steve and Nelly, who are on our editorial board, to make judgments about what we publish. So it's coming from a constituency, and then the question is is there a perception that these journals, relative to each other and relative to others, are not open to work about the various difference that you mentioned? If that's the perception, well, let me just state flatly, it's wrong. We're certainly open to it, and we'd like to see more of it.
Let me just jump right in and clarify this point. I'm really glad that you raised this, Mike, because I did not at all mean to suggest that I imagine that there's some kinds of invidious or exclusionary gatekeeping practices that are keeping crucial articles on these topics out of the pages of 3S or STHV. I was picking these journals as sort of emblematic of the field with the various problems in doing so that Nelly quite rightly pointed to. So I think that I imagine that this is largely a problem having to do with the amount of sort of attention and resources and just how much work is being done in these particular areas, rather than a lack of appreciation for the work on the part of journal reviewers or certainly its editors. I agree with you that it's an empirical question. Ultimately, one could examine what comes in the door versus what gets published in the end. But I personally would be surprised if there were sort of some kind of dirty secret that got revealed in the process about exclusionary practices. Pardon me? Yes.
Yeah. Can I also shortly, of course we can't find any final explanation here, but I think there's a lot of work done on, this all the issues mentioned here in the panel. And I think it shows more a specialization issue about what I know, at least from the scholars I know who are doing this kind of work. They usually go to other journals and not to STHV or Social Studies of Science. But, for example, for gender studies, there are so many excellent journals out there. And so that's one explanation, I think. So it shows the richness of, all the different possibilities for publication. Having said that, of course, we can be reflective on why STHV and SSS are not more successful in attracting those great scholars, because I know there is so much exciting work going on there. So why do they stick to their own disciplinary boundaries, so to speak? So it's, again, about how inclusive are we in terms of getting other people, to publish also in our field. And obviously, most authors don't make this decision and think the other journals who explicitly address gender or race or whatever, or, for example, whole sociology of medicine, they stick to their own journals. So I don't know if we should consider this as a problem or not.
I think Ben, have your hand up? Oh, Joan.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I wanted to comment or maybe ask a question to Sherine. I think, at least speaking as an old-timer, one of the goals was to actually dissect this religion of science, and I think that STS has done a lot with that goal. But I agree that we haven't addressed religion per se, the other religions. Although everybody seems to be commenting on Francis Collins and his Mormonism for most recently. But I guess my question is, it goes back to the panel before this. What are the boundaries? So we have religious studies programs in most universities. We have certainly sociology of religion, and I'm assuming that there are other religious studies within different disciplines. So I'm wondering, Nelly just said people publish in medical sociology journals or in gender journals. So it's the same thing here. Where, I mean, is it our failure, or are people actually studying science and religion in other sections of certainly academia and maybe elsewhere as well? So I don't know that literature, so I'm asking you whether you actually see studies of science in religious studies journals or elsewhere.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joan. I mean, I think one of the critiques I was trying to make, but maybe I didn't say this clear enough, is that there's been this problematic assumption about the relationship between religion and science being the same kind of relationship everywhere, and that's why we get this complete mismatch or a failure to recognize what's actually happening in a lot of places. And I only can tell you from anthropology, I think there's very little being done on looking at the production of religious knowledge in an STS type of way, and looking at how practitioners of religion come to understand which scientific forms of evidence are more or less compelling. And I don't know why that's the case, but I'm thinking, along with Suman, that there are certain assumptions that we take about what's rational and what isn't, or what's cultural and what isn't, that then lead us to not recognize other people's formulations and justifications for doing their work.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, Ben, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Just
Ben Hurlbut
orchestrating the ones that will follow.
Ben Hurlbut from Arizona State University. So I'm not totally convinced by what I'm about to say, so I'm sort of thinking out loud here. But in any case, it seems to me, so I'm concerned about the characterization of difference that has emerged from this panel. It seems to me that there is a lot more space. It could be much more inclusive than it is, and in fact would include a much larger body of STS scholarship if it's imagined slightly differently. It seems to me that our concerns with sameness, with the production of commensurability, with universality, et cetera, very much fits within a sort of larger, a more inclusive imagination of what the study of difference might include. Let me give a little bit of an odd example for where STS scholarship is productive here. So there's been a move in certain domains in political theory, particularly actually after 9/11, away from the secularization hypothesis towards this notion of post-secularization, right? And the idea here is that the notions of the public sphere that were operative in the old days, in the sort of 70s through 90s, aren't good enough anymore. In fact, there are these different competencies that exist, and one particularly important set of competencies are religious perspectives, reservoirs of meaning, and that they occupy an appropriate space in the public sphere. And that's different from post-Enlightenment secular rationality, and these should cohabit somehow, something like this. It seems to me that this is a very, very problematic formulation precisely because STS has spent a lot of time demonstrating how, in fact, publics are emergent in much more complex ways than this, and you can't map them out. And in fact, these normative characterizations are productive precisely of conditions of possibility of emergence of publics, et cetera. So it seems to me that taking on things like the liberal subject, taking on the constructions of sameness, for example, that inform the conditions of possibility for the emergence of articulations of difference in Steve's really great recent book, are themselves studies of difference, because they are the deeper, more distributed architectures, in fact, more powerful architectures than a kind of set of categories that are almost ahistorical, almost decontextualized, that we mark as the objects of difference and then sort of try to follow around.
No, absolutely. I mean, certainly we shouldn't be invested in a kind of literal stabilization of these categories for exactly the reasons that Nelly was pointing out, and I completely agree with. And in fact, my starting point was saying that one of the things that STS has been very good at doing is in finding these ways of studying all sorts of instances of difference-making and sameness-making practices, right? And so part of what I think we want to do is bring those kinds of techniques and analyses together with a set of political questions having to do with various kinds of collectivities, identities, and statuses that have a certain set of political stakes connected up with them because of particular histories in particular locations, but without submerging those political concerns, I think, within a more generalized concern with difference understood in this sense as any instance of difference making, right? So my only concern with what you're saying, and in many ways I'm sympathetic, because obviously these are things that could be studied, and obviously they could be counted up in my numerical, operationalizing for demonstration and provocation purposes is clearly, a little silly on some level. The only risk that I see is that this more extensive and comprehensive and generous and capacious and other sorts of good things notion of difference that we do study and could be studying more, if in calling that difference we might then lose a kind of commitment to investigating a more particular set of questions and concerns, not to be reduced to certain fixed categorical boxes, I completely agree, that have tremendous salience in the world that we live in and that we need to be attending to in particular ways.
I'll just briefly answer with an example of a work like Didier Fassin's When Bodies Remember. And I think what's so interesting about that book, but I would have liked him to flesh this out a bit more, was that there could have been a way to take Thabo Mbeki's denialism of HIV as the causal agent of AIDS, as a sort of irrational, supernatural, it's in a realm different from that of scientific argumentation. And what Didier shows in that book is that, in fact, it's the failure of a reductionist biomedical logic that only looks at sexual transmission or sexual behavior that ends up not explaining and not being a compelling explanatory factor for the very different rates of spread among blacks and whites in post-apartheid South Africa, right? So it's because of the poverty of the biological explanation to explain the social phenomenon, and he says it's because it doesn't adequately take into account all of these historical factors like the geography of mining towns and the exploitation of labor and the availability of alcohol and prostitution, like all of these historical structural conditions that enabled spread of disease more rapidly among one society than another, was completely missed in the argument about its purely biological contagion, and therefore the only explanatory mechanism you had for high rates of infection among blacks was sexual pathology. And because that didn't resonate among blacks in South Africa, that led to an increase of people who then, whatever you want to call it, because of religion or because of anti-colonialism or because of all of these sort of sentiments, then fell into the Thabo Mbeki camp of HIV denialism. So I think just that example of sometimes it's conditions of science or failures in technology or the unconvincingness of particular scientific argumentation that can give rise to religious or other types of explanations. And that link, I think, is what we're not adequately addressing. Because we see those realms as so separate.
So just to hop in for a second as a chair, I think that Ben's provocation and the panel's response to it seems to point a bit to a human-non-human actor divide we might have in trying to formulate the way we approach difference, right? So that we want to separate difference and maybe not use it as a term or maybe separate it as an actor's term, but in order to do so, those actors must be able to speak it. And so what we talk about in studying the same making processes, for example, that go beyond declaring GMO foods different or same to non-GMO foods, or in setting standards by which so many parts per billion of mercury are allowable in something that can be standardized as pure water that is the same as pure water one gets from somewhere else, is a very different way of approaching difference, because that water and that most of those genetically modified organisms are unable to speak specifically, and yet we still might argue that STS has a critical set of contributions to make to this approach in difference that also can then inflect back on the forms of difference that we are using as an actor's category. So I'd just like to reflect that back to okay, we have a number of questions still at large. I think we have one coming from right over here. Yes, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Richardson from Harvard, and I have a question it comes from Rebecca Jordan-Young's recent book, Brainstorms. In the introduction to that book, she noted that many of her STS colleagues found hopelessly retrogressive and unsophisticated her effort to do a thorough, rigorous, empirical and methodological critique of the field of kind of brain gender research and hormonal brain organization research. This is the strain of work on race and gender and sexuality interested in doing empirical and methodological critique. Sometimes, according to Jordan Young, experiences a kind of pushback from STS that this is retrogressive and unsophisticated, identifying bias, for example, in areas of the sciences. I wonder if you could address her observation.
Well, I don't think anyone who knows Beck would call her unsophisticated or anything of the sort. I'm, actually somewhat surprised to learn that she feels that she gets that response from STS folks. I think that this may be a way of talking about how to venture into a different kind of political project in which she wants to speak to a variety of different audiences about various kinds of issues and problems with the ways in which sex differences in the brain have been described over time. And sees a certain kind of tension between a more an approach emphasizing debunking of problematic claims and an approach that these other kinds of STS perspectives. I should say that I have read her previous work and, despite flashing the cover, have not fully digested the recent book itself. So I don't feel I can fully speak to what she's doing there. But I don't, from knowing her and the work that I've read in the past, I don't have the sense of a tension with that this sort of problem really exists, and that that there's any inherent conflict in, from an STS perspective, finding ways of developing a critique of scientific practice that's grounded in their practice. I mean, these are questions that we all wrestle with in different ways and have different kind of answers too, but I don't think that there's a kind of ruling out of bounds in any sense. More than that, I think I would have to look more, and think more about it.
Maybe I can add to it. For me, it's a bit surprising to see that is, as I also mentioned in my short discussion, we see a kind of rehearsal taking place in the brain sciences and genetics about discussions about nature and nurture, but also among STS or feminist scholars themselves. So sometimes I'm puzzled to see that a book published now on the brain, if you compare it with the work, at least what I'm familiar with in the European context, done, I guess, 20 years ago. It's basically reframing, maybe a bit different terminology, but just, a rehearsal of the same discussion. So I think that's a bit worrying. So in that terms, I think, well, there's work still to be done about maybe the different generations in STS or in social science communities, to learn and to reflect on, our own history, our own previous books, so to speak, and not almost having the idea of reinventing the wheel all the time. I don't know if other people have this experience, Sometimes I think, we just should learn about what we said 20 years ago compared to what we're doing now. So it's... And I have a bit of the impression about the discussion on brains, on genes, on hormones. It's just a rehearsal of the same debate all over the time. So what can we do here to rephrase it in a certain way? And I think the panel, what we're trying to do, I really appreciate your approach to get to, and I also want to respond to the previous question on, is difference not a very limited kind of looking at this issue? I think we still have to use it as a category ourselves to go to these important issues. Otherwise, it's all, well, where we're talking about, it's too general. We can't, go into methodologies, we can't go into topics. So it's maybe what I would like to say.
Yeah.
Hi, Chris Jones from Harvard University, and I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Alastair Isles next to me right after it's being created. This is a question I had in the last panel, and I think comes through in this panel as well. And Javier, I think, put it very nicely. He asked not just where are we going, but what's the baggage we're taking with us, or who are the intellectual companions that we're taking with us? And I think this really structures the questions of what STS asks, and we've seen a lot of examples. If you go to a biology lab in India and you take post-colonial scholars with you, you're going to ask and find profoundly different things than if you're looking into the nature of the biological enterprise. Similarly, if you're going into medical trials and you're asking questions about class and gender, you're going to get different answers. And so I'm curious, at a sort of broader level, is there a way of conceptualizing the relationship between STS and different approaches, or which of these other approaches do we need to bring more strongly into STS? How can we do that as scholars, and how does that shape what has happened? What would you see, particularly keeping the theme here of next 20 years, what are the sort of intellectual companions you'd like us to see bringing in so that we can make STS improve?
Who wants to take that one first?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think this is also a discussion about the field, about STS. Do we see it as a discipline, or, well, who are we having conversations with? Where do we publish? And I think it's very important, if I talk about my own practice now, I think my intellectual companions are more also outside the field in terms of human geography and health geography, where they really have this awareness of spaces where for knowledge production, for performances of difference or whatever. So taking this, what would be my intellectual companions now, and having also this conversation also between STS and other disciplines is very important. Also in terms of the field, and I think this is also in terms of relevance for the programs we have. If I talk about the Netherlands, we also try to have a graduate school there, where we increasingly invite non-STSs to present their work. So even to talk about STSs and non-STSs, I think can be problematic. But I think that would be more. I only now mentioned human geography and health geography because it was related to the work I did on telecare technologies. But I see all other people doing similar stuff, We have this phrase now of building bridges between fields. So this is this awareness that we should not be too, inside bounded as a discipline, I think, or as a field. Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely don't think that there's any sort of particular answer to the question, or privileged set of theories that go with STS in some way organically or better than other theories do, or anything of that sort. I mean, I think that I was sort of serious at the beginning of my remarks when I said that it's great that we're coming together to debate these questions, and I hope we don't agree. I think that the only way ultimately that the question can be answered is in the particular, as Nelly was also just doing, in terms of what kinds of theoretical perspectives can be usefully combined. And for me, it's always been. I mean, I've been relatively opportunistic about this. It's dependent on the particular questions that I'm asking. In this work on inclusion and difference, it's informed and inflected by a lot of political sociology, looking at questions of state classification, looking at questions of social movements and framing and activism, but also by a lot of feminist theory and gender and sexuality studies, and a lot of work that's been done on race. So certainly, you're quite right that the particular tools and theoretical concepts that we pick up are then going to have consequences for the ways that we frame the questions. But I would also hope that through the juxtaposition, some new questions do emerge, and that then, as we travel with that baggage, light or heavy as it may have then become, that it can still do some useful work. But I have trouble addressing the question in an abstract sense.
So, I mean, I think one thought I'd just like to insert in here is this question of traveling companions. It's a very nice metaphor. And yet I think there's also a bit of a problem we have of our own inclusion difference paradigm, perhaps, as a field, in which one doesn't want certain digestible categories of difference to be necessary traveling companions that are therefore formalized and tokenized in that process. And there's a risk of, I mean, it's quite important to ask the role of race, class, gender, X, Y, Z in any study that we're doing. But I guess that's the question that I have, is how do we actually take the field and continue to invert these forms or displace them into other locales, so that one is not really absorbing, but also putting out challenging propositions to how we actually conceptualize difference that extend out into other fields. And I think this comes out of many of the panelists' talks today. It's continuously a challenge to think of how not to merely passively allow forms of thought and logic to accrete into our own studies. So I think in some ways what I'm rambling towards as an answer here is that it's not so much a problem of choosing one's companions as learning to be aware of one's companions, and I think that it's a continuous process of self-reflexivity that we need to keep on working on. There are a number of other questions out in the panel. Right here, yes.
Thanks. Brian Wynn from Lancaster. Thanks to all three panelists. I put my hand up a while ago, and Ben's question, observation, challenge to you was actually pretty much in the spirit of, mine was in the same spirit, which is really inviting you to extend your definitions of difference that you're dealing with and reviewing STS's approaches to include other domains, which I think actually Sherine's response to Ben over the Mbeki case and HIV/AIDS in Africa was doing in a very organic kind of way. And I just really was inviting to extend from the cases which you've been mainly describing or starting from, which have been about the naturalization of difference in domains like gender, sex, race, etc., to think about cases where we've got difference denied. And actually, a lot of STS's own currency there has done this for a long time. So controversy studies have been doing precisely that in many respects. But I guess, going back to the Mbeki example, I think the reductionist account of it's a scientific reality or it's nothing describes precisely that kind of deletion of legitimate difference over precisely the contextual conditions of HIV/AIDS in Africa that you were just summarizing in the book, whose author I'd like to get from you, Dominique, I didn't catch the surname, but it sounds extremely valuable in that respect.
Is that Didier Fasson?
Didier Fasson.
Yeah.
Fasson. Didier Fasson.
Fasson. Okay.
Fasson.
I'll get that later. Thanks. So I just wanted to invite you to think about and extend discussion into those domains where we've actually got difference denied, or perhaps reduced from hermeneutic, ontological, political difference to epistemic difference. They don't understand the usual kind of one-dimensional reductionist account of publics and their responses.
I think that's a wonderful question, wonderful way to pose it. The example that came to my head was when doctors in Egypt said that the person who had irrecoverable brain damage, who was on a life respirating machine, whose heart was beating and lungs were still pumping, was not the same thing as a cadaver. And if somebody took a gun into an ICU and was to shoot that person, would we merely call that desecration of a dead body, or would we not consider that murder? And I think that another difference that was being deleted, aside from there's a very different reorganization of death, was the question of scale. And so when the Grand Mufti of Egypt, who is supposed to give the Islamic opinion about what can we do with this person on the life respirator, can we harvest that person's organs, the question posed to him was, is this person dead the way the cadaver was dead? And his answer was no. Now, the problem was that he was faulted for not enabling a cadaveric transplant program for an entire nation. And there I think it's also the denial of difference in scale, because he was asked to look at this one person who was breathing, but he wasn't asked if an entire nation whose hundreds of millions of people in organ failure desperately need organs, might we not, allow for that the scale of that question was so different, and he was faulted for stopping something at a national level when he was asked to look at the individual patient. And I think that's something also to think about in terms of denial of difference.
Yeah, I will just agree. I think that these cases that are being pointed to concerning the where difference is denied are crucially important, and ones where STS scholars have been looking for some time, but where they could definitely, there's a lot more work to be done. I agree. Whether it's precisely the, I guess I fear a sort of diversion of some of the most productive aspects of this conversation if it becomes too much of a question about how exactly we restrict or not this category of STS studies on difference, which was the sort of name bequeathed to this panel, but I'm not sure that it ought to define the research question or question of identity or mission or whatever that we might be here to actually discuss. But as a crucial area of research that clearly interweaves with the set of concerns that we've talked about here. Yeah.
I can also shortly answer your question. I think it's very important. I don't agree with Steve that we should do more on this. I think if we look at gender studies in particular, it is not a notion to start with difference, to look at certain techno-scientific practices, but to go into techno-scientific practices to see whether or how, also the example you raised, we can give much more examples and studies that have been done exactly on the denial of difference. That's, it's not only the construction of but also the silencing of difference, and how this shapes the development of a whole field of inquiry, or how it shapes technologies. For example, if I look at some of my work of my current PhD students, they look, for example, on the whole development of new technologies for elderly people, where you have this notion of age. Well, you see a lot of construction of difference, but a denial of difference, also in terms of the technologies, in terms of the social categories, so it's all there. So I guess it's maybe more a kind of artifact of the panel that we are asked to focus on STS on difference, that we don't contextualize it in all the studies that we are doing now. So I don't agree that we don't do this. I think there's a lot interesting work.
Can I just add another example? Yeah. Something where I think STS is really strong in doing is refusing the this complete separation between the sociological and the biological or the natural world. So another example that comes to mind is that bioethics literature states things like, it is not, it is a tolerable harm for a healthy person to donate a kidney because the body doesn't need 2 kidneys, et cetera. And that's taken to be a universal bodily fact. And so when you find resistance in pockets of the world like Pakistan or India or Egypt to the idea that it wouldn't be harmful to donate your own kidney, that's relegated then in the dominant discourse, that's relegated to cultural attitudes. But in fact, you can see, well, if somebody is immunosuppressed because there's very high rates of hepatitis C or schistosomiasis, diarrheal diseases, when the surgical methods are not the same, when the anesthesia is available or not of the same quality, when people aren't given the same amount of time to recuperate, are we actually talking about biologically the same thing? So the difference can only be explained in the cultural, social, political domain. And I think STS has given me that lens where I can say, wait, there's something that's totally being denied right here. And it's that the biological ground, which has been assumed to be the same, isn't.
This is a question from Alastair Isles from Berkeley. In thinking about difference, I think it's important not to limit this discussion to human subjects only. Diversity can be taken further as a conceptual thread to interrogate what differences are invoked to do in the realm of animals, ecosystems, and the environment. So for example, one way that food systems have been set up is to distinguish ourselves from the animals that we eat. Another way that food systems have been built is to simplify production into monocultures rather than drawing on diverse foods, farmers, and environments. STS can contribute much by taking this broader, less anthropocentric view. I'd be curious to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that that's clearly an area where STS would be well positioned to have some very interesting things to say, and I'm sure already is. I guess that I would say, and this is in some sense a response to Jeremy as well, who quite rightly raised this issue, that the point is not to be anthropocentric in the analysis, but it is perhaps to point to the differences that may emerge in terms of the ways that human actors may represent themselves and organize around different categories and the kinds of looping effects that may result from that work. That by no means means that the non-human actors shouldn't be studied in terms of the ways in which difference is constantly being defined and negotiated there. Yeah.
I would just add that that's another example where I see sort of Western Christian ideas of human agency versus divine agency smuggled into STS methodologies without being recognized. And I think that, sort of these questions about what about the non-human actors that are limiting human agency would be really obvious to the peasants in Dipesh Chakrabarty's study in India, who knew that it wasn't just them, that it was also gods who were playing a role in who would win these post-colonial battles. And so I think also to think about supernatural agents is important, or the deletion of them.
So, and likewise, I think that this question really, it's very well suited to this conference, that it points us back towards areas of real robust strength in where STS studies have come from. We think of studies of classification, we think of studies of standardization, and then the question is, how are there new ways to reconfigure these fields? What happens when we reattend to the problem of similarity, for example, and its particular politics? I find myself coming back in some ways to, I would like to segue that question to a question for Sherine in particular. I've been mulling over this in my head, that this lack of a symmetric reinvestigation of the ways in which the sociology of religion is like the sociology of science, right? Which is to say, not to go back to Durkheim, but to actually somehow use the STS specific armamentarium on religion on par with science. In a way, we see vestiges of that from these STS works on classification. I mean, I think of appropriating a book like Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger, for example. It really grounds its origins in Leviticus and expressly purposes our studying of classification systems in religious studies, which doesn't necessarily attempt to make that differentiation between religion and science. And it strikes me as a bit of a model for what you're looking for. And I think if we look a bit deeper, we find a lot of this within the anthropology of medicine and science, and presumably within other domains of sociology as well. I'm wondering how you situate those works.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the difference between the Mary Douglas approach and what I'm talking about is that the contemporary world that I'm imagining has labels for things and boundary markers for what constitutes real science or what constitutes real tradition. And so to take this sort of or perspective and just look at systems of classification without attending to the very powerful work that these boundaries and labels are said to do would be problematic, which is what Mary Douglas isn't giving us an example of the weight and the power given to particular boundaries of modern science and whether it's granted entry or not into what then becomes religious knowledge. Right?
So in some ways, if I can rephrase it, the problem is that it's a double shift, that for Douglas, this is ancient and it's religious. Once you shift towards the modern, there is science, and science becomes a different sphere than religion. And you're trying to actually problematize the contemporary in a way that her analysis doesn't really allow for.
No.
There's in some ways a co-localization of religion, science, and past-present, which happens in that work.
No. So I think in the Muslim world, I think both pre-modern and modern, there is a very different configuration between what later gets called science and what later gets called religion. And that the word ulum, for example, which is sciences, is used for the traditional linguistic or philology of the Quran, for example, and for biological natural world astronomy. And that later those terms and divisions come to take very different shapes and come to do different types of social work. And so one would have to not only attend to what are the forms of argumentation within these fields, but also how are the boundaries maintained and what work are those boundaries doing.
Now, I know there are a number of questions. Yes.
Peter Taylor, UMass Boston. Look, Nelly suggested diversity as well as difference, but of course we've got this third term, heterogeneity, which I think is relevant. And I think it's particularly relevant to this session, STS 20 years before and after. So that refers back to an origin of public funding, and Sheila organized it. And at Cornell 20 years ago, when she was organizing that first bit of funding in her time course, there was already a 20-year-old program, undergraduate program called Biology and Society. So if we're trying to account for, that was mostly science majors, trying to extend their perspectives on what it was they're getting into. So if we wanted to do an accounting, we'd have to think about, well, where are they now? And most of them aren't in STS. So if STS defines itself as the thing that ends up being the kind of people who end up here, then it's one thing. But if it's more inclusive, includes all the students we have in our courses, not even in our STS courses, because there did start to be an STS major at Cornell at the same time too, then I think we get a more interesting picture. But we get a picture that's also one of heterogeneity, because these students are not becoming something STS-ish. They're using some resources, pick and choose, maybe mashing them, and taking them into their lives as scientists. And you have to follow up. And sometimes you follow up these days by Googling people, or they Google you and you make connections. And it's a very interesting range of kinds of things they're doing. And just yesterday I was telling someone about a poor student at Cornell who came into my office hours who said, I don't know whether I'm pre-law or pre-med. In her view of things, there were only two choices. But of course, the students who ended up, 20 years later, they've taken a lot of different kinds of choices. So I think this, once we pay attention to life course, it's not just a life course of STS, 20 more, it's a life course of these students. We have to pay attention to heterogeneity, because it isn't just the way they take pieces from us, it's the heterogeneity of things they bring in. And my experience as a scientist is always that a particular episode of science, you know, at that local level where you might be trying to change it, is always a matter of diverse practical resources, some of which you can nudge and change. And maybe STS, the field that we've been referring to here, is a little bit too big a category. It's not paying as much attention, or it's looking for nicer resolutions than you get in that messy heterogeneity of people constructing their science and their practice and their life courses, and they're changing. And I think an interesting sort of little observation about heterogeneity is, you know, one of our biggest figures in the field of STS is Bruno Latour, of course. In '87, his book says, you know, scientists mobilize heterogeneous resources, but it stops really at that point. The existence of this phenomena that we mobilize heterogeneous resources, it doesn't really tell you how someone would see which ones make a difference, how you would, you know, reconstruct them as a scholar, and then how you would reconstruct them as a practitioner. And so it's gone to like places where we can resolve and stabilize rather than where we stay with the heterogeneity. And I think that's a political issue too. I mean, it doesn't, part of heterogeneity is dealing with the politics of difference, of course. But it's also a philosophical issue. STS has its origins. One of its origin stories is in SSK, which is a philosophical sociology, which wants to try to get themes that can be generalized. And maybe that's a legacy, part of the baggage someone mentioned. But it's also, in the end, the most important issue is the people we're influencing. And as academics, our biggest lot of subjects are our students. And maybe our second biggest lot of subjects are the subjects we work with too, who go on in their heterogeneous ways as well.
Thanks. So I'll take that more as a comment than a question.
No, I want
Yes.
to react to it because there's a new thing in the discussion popping up now that's important, I think, to think about STS. I mean, if you mention now biology society programs, I know at the Cornell University it's still part of a department of what's called STS. If I look at the Netherlands, I mean, I was one of these biology students who was crazy enough to think about we could raise a new field. So we made a biology society program ourselves. But it doesn't exist anymore. So there's something there that in terms of what you call about the origin stories of STS is different for the different places we come from. But I think what's very important, adding to the discussion as well, is what do we teach our students? I guess that most of us teach also, at least in my case, I used to teach courses to biology students. Now my main audience are engineering students. And of course, they take up also, you know, notions of co-production, co-construction, but they will never publish in our journals. But I'm pretty sure, I've some very bright students I still follow through the years, and I see the places where they are in now. They make a difference in terms of reconceptualizing very important issues of science and technology. So I think this is something we miss now in the conversation if we focus too much on STS as a discipline or a kind of field, but also take into account, well, all the people, well, what we are doing in teaching. And I agree that biology is a society, looking at heterogeneity, the things, also people going back to the laboratories and taking our, you know, knowledge, so to speak. It's very important to see how STS matters for which audiences. I agree on that. Yeah.
Did you want to respond to that point? Or?
Me?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Okay. No, fantastic. Let's see. I think we've got about roughly a half hour left. A number of questions. So might want to try and field a few in a row. Yes.
I'm Ben Cohen at the University of Virginia. This question actually follows. This follows, I think, from that, and I want to push farther on it, taking to heart the kind of the perspectives of the forum of the next 20 years and conversations not just within but beyond, the beyond part. So I don't know if I'm also segueing to the next session that we have in an hour or so. But I want to push on the difference in terms of relevance and audience, just to hear the panel talk more about to whom do any of these studies about difference make a difference? Like, who are we really speaking to? And that's why, in addition to students, you kind of helped lead into talking about the student forum, but even that is still intra-academic, and we don't really know. except from when a couple students come back in 5 years and say they were really influenced by what they had learned in some class. And so I guess I want to push to find out what people think, or what the panelists think, about not just moving from the back of the journal to the front of the journal, but moving out of the journal, or finding out ways in the everyday world where any of our studies actually do make some kind of difference, or how we might strategize about different ways to speak to different audiences. The second part, which is the shorter part, is even then, how do you think about and how do we conceptualize audiences, not so much in a homogeneous way? There's so many different heterogeneous constructions of what an audience is, so it's sort of like a twofold process.
Well, thanks for that question. In some ways, I might try and augment it a little bit by suggesting how we actually look at that impact is having intended and unintended consequences as well. I mean, in some ways, one way of reading your most recent book, Steve, is to say, well, here are some STS questions that actually become incorporated into this inclusion difference paradigm in ways that have many unintended consequences. And so to read inclusion as a statement of a form of impact of certain STS questions, once they become incorporated and then repurposed by specific institutional audiences, kind of there's accessing those audiences, and then there's actually trying to do something responsible with those audiences when they use our works. Have you thought about your work in those contexts?
A little, but these are really difficult questions. I mean, it's very important questions. I do think, first of all, that moving from the back of the book to the front of the book is important to talk about as well. I think that it is a problem if STS work on a whole variety of topics, including things like racial meanings and identities and categories and sex and gender and so on, are not well represented in the journals that most people who study those topics generally look to for some of the sort of authoritative viewpoints on those issues. So I think that we need to be there as well. I think that's very, very important. But I agree we should talk about what's going on beyond there in various different domains. I mean, I think that building on something that I think that Peter said, it's worth talking about our interlocutor participants. I mean, for example, people in the audience like Joan and Greene and others who are involved with in close engagement with scientists about the meanings that they make of the racial categories that they use in their work, can talk about the kinds of impact that such work might have on scientific knowledge practices or the beliefs or practices of those individual scientists, etc. I don't know. But in terms of as other worlds, policy arenas, and so on, I think that it is complex because there are problems of suggested by Jeremy, suggested by Nelly, having to do with a kind of reinforcement of unproblematic understandings of meanings and categories in ways that can be sometimes strategic in the short run, but rather counterproductive. And I talk about this in my work in relation to health and how one tries to address health disparities and the extent to which this requires certain kinds of mobilization around accepted categories, but the extent to which doing so can actually complicate the effort. So I think the question is how that STS sensibility about the histories and heterogeneous meanings of the categories that we use and organize around can, in a critical way, be brought back into as a policy discussion. I mean, that's not something I have a sort of clear, simple kind of blueprint answer to. I mean, I think that that is something that we really need to be struggling with and figuring out how to create lines of argumentation that go beyond, to hark back to the last panel, simply saying, hey, wait, there's more complexity here than is typically acknowledged, but that actually is able to make a point about alternative ways of of framing and analysis. I mean, sometimes what that means is deflecting, figuring out how to strategically deflect a particular kind of line of policy intervention that is assumed that one approaches a question of difference in a particular way. Here are the groups one speaks to. You know, here are their designated representatives. Let's get them in a room, now we proceed. And instead to kind of suggest how even the choice of categories in any given moment has to be looked at concretely in the moment. I realize I need to be much more specific in order to make this make sense. I'm speaking in generalities, but but I think that I feel that I'm with you in terms of trying to figure out ways that STS can, scholars can very productively, contributing to those kinds of interventions and discussions. I don't, we are heterogeneous. There is no single way that will happen, but I think there are multiple.
I think there's, in the back of my mind too, I'm thinking of when we're writing that claims for broader impacts on a grant, like, are we doing that better? Are there new ways? Is that moving ahead? Or are we going to write an op-ed for the local paper and that counts as a broader impact?
Can I continue this issue of audiences? I think, and be a bit more specific than Steve was, I think maybe it comes from my specific situation now working at a technical university. And I think this is interesting in itself to see. I used to work at University of Amsterdam, and then, you were just talking to your own colleagues all the time, basically. I mean, whereas at a technical university, we are forced to talk and teach and collaborate with engineers as well. And on the one hand, this is very productive. So here, audiences are for us engineers as well. And at least at the University of Twente, we developed this constructive technology assessment approach by saying, okay, we can use our knowledge to have conversations with engineers and not only reflecting on their practices, but also giving feedback of the insights we gained from studying them towards thinking about not how to make better technology, so to speak, but how to make them more reflect on their own practices. And I think that's also part of STS. So it's definitely not only that we talk to audiences like social scientist scholars or whoever, but also engineers. And what I see happening now in this whole changing field of funding going on in Europe at least, is that we are increasingly forced to look at collaborations with engineers, and I see a problem here popping up, because then all of a sudden, if we talk about these collaborations, if we can't choose it ourselves anymore, if it's forced on us by funding agencies that we should collaborate, for example, with Philips, and not with the engineers I can choose, then you have a problem. So I think it's very important that we are aware and we work with the people we are studying, but this has restrictions in itself. So this is at least what's happening in the European context. It's very problematic.
So at this point, there are a number of questions, about 15 minutes. So what I'd like to do is actually accumulate some questions for the panel. So if maybe we could start, where are we starting? Yes.
Oh, okay.
And for the rest of you that actually have a question, if you could just raise your hand so I have a sense of where you actually
okay,
where you
I'll
are.
try to make it quick. The basic idea is policy. It really challenges me in this context because in policy in terms of...
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of, okay, what does a policymaker do on this score? In Steve, in a lot of your work, you've actually, I guess, documented well that the benevolent use and uptake of racial categories in order to redress perceived injustices like say clinical trials and the ignoring certain groups in medicine can actually feed back into has a feedback effect that can reify certain kinds of conceptions into ethnic drugs and so forth. In constitutional law, the recognition that there's discrimination sort of across the board creates a jurisprudence of suspect classifications, which then is used by later on as a hammer against affirmative action policies. There's the debates over should data be collected by race from a social science point of view in order to document evidence of discrimination, and how that then promotes a data set driven by race. So the question is, what do you recommend doing in terms of codification of difference into certain kinds of societal structures, law, so forth? Is that simply a bad idea because of looping effects that go wild and we don't exactly know where it's going to end up in the ways in which it's going to only promote the kinds of injustices we care about? So then we should do it from below and do strategic kinds of things from below. Or can you guide us in making certain kinds of institutional interventions from the top? And if, I don't know, if you have ideas on that piece, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Sam Smiley. I'm a media artist, so I'm interested in the idea of audience, which has just now come up. I think that's interesting. But one of the questions I had was, just looking at the future of STS, is are there other STS frameworks that are developing, but they're in different languages? And should that be something that people are writing, creating literature in languages other than English? And should that be something that should be considered sort of as a wide question?
I wanted to get back to Chris's question and sort of respond to that, but turn that response into a question for the panel, which is that my sense of the way in which Chris took Javier's point about traveling companions was in terms of bodies of work that one needed to travel with and know and cite. And I think that's necessary, but I don't think that's sufficient. And so I'm a little bit worried at stopping with that, in the sense that I don't think what's at stake here is just, well, if you're studying science, you take STS along, and if you're studying it in the post-colony, you take post-colonial studies along with it. And for that, I think back to a conversation that I had 10 years ago with Donna Haraway that's really stuck with me when I was still a PhD student. And Haraway was telling me you should be more attentive to gender. And I said, how do you do that? And she said, well, it's just a mode of attentiveness. And I remember this phrase that Javier liked actually was her phrase that stuck with me for a long. She said it's a mode of attentiveness and vigilance. And she didn't say anything more. She didn't teach me how to do gender. And there's, by no stretch of imagination am I now a feminist science studies scholar as a consequence of that. But it has taught me to be uncomfortable about questions of gender. And so it makes me constantly ask myself, when I'm not stubbing my toe against gender, is it because I don't get it, or is there because gender is being occluded in very particular ways in the worlds that I study in ways that are inaccessible to me? And so it opens up a certain modality of vigilance that of course I'm helped by reading feminist science studies, but that I wouldn't just get from reading Haraway and Franklin and Rapp and Locke and the whole repertoire. And that's part of the excitement for me now about being in anthropology, is that its openness to science studies is not simply an openness to suddenly studying science and technology as objects, but is a radical interrogation of its own practices because of lessons that it's learned from science studies. And so, you know, I've advised students who work on secularism in Iran and human rights in Costa Rica who are doing science studies projects because they internalize sensibilities of co-production and such like. So I guess the question for the panel then is, how might you teach us to think differentially, even if the object of our analysis was not race or gender or sexuality or religion?
Thank you, Kaushik. And taking vigilance to heart, let me make sure that I'm being attentive and vigilant enough to all of your questions. Are there any remaining? I see Ben's hand up, and okay, just a few more in the field. Okay, just want to collect these last three.
My first?
Yeah.
So actually, just to follow on very quickly on Kaushik's comment, I mean, it seems to me that this sort of mode of attentiveness articulation is very good for this. But I want to go back. A couple of times it was roughly said that if one expands the kind of category of the forms of difference that we attend to, it dissolves into a problem that's too big and we require focus. Sherine said that there are, in the little discussion on Mary Douglas said, no, there are labels of difference, boundary labels that are very important. We need to attend to those labels. So it seems to me that we might want to include in our, I'm asking this as a question, is it an appropriate mode of attentiveness to include in our repertoire a focus on the very large, the kinds of constitutional dispensations, the orientations, the large, almost the metaphysics of difference and sameness that, in a sense, permeate almost every dimension of this field. Maintain that mode of attentiveness as a way of asking questions about why these particular kinds of labels have the power that they have, because, of course, our whole discipline is about how homogenization and differentiation are a post-metaphysical account of these processes that reveal structures of power that matter. I mean, it seems to me that this is a theoretical problem, but also an ethical problem, because yes, we want to engage where there is normative and in the domains where there are normative and political imperatives that attach them, but at the same time, perhaps a productive way to engage with those is to step far back from them and think about the deep underlying architectures that inform, domains as apparently different as, biodiversity, human subjects research, biosimilarity. In fact, there may be underlying architectures that are cross-cutting and inform all of these, and is that not a very important domain for attentiveness to difference?
So one more question, and then we'll let the panel respond.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my name is Kjetil Rommetveit. I'm from University of Bergen, Norway. It's a question about traveling companions, maybe particularly to Steve Epstein. I have been interested in what you could call, in broad terms, identity management systems. I mean, some of the ways in which the categories that you have been talking about are going digital in these days. So, I mean, the things that may emerge from biobanks or electronic health registries or biometric databases and so on and so forth. I think there are quite significant challenges in these fields, or this field, where STS could contribute. I mean, both in terms of the ways in new categories are being technologically constructed on the engineering side. There is the question of how are categories naturalized and implemented through code, software, system architecture, and so on. And on the policy side, at least in Europe, there is also the question as to the kinds of categories that are being used to discuss the implementation of these very systems. I mean, where you typically have huge simplifications such as security versus individual, society versus individual. I mean, these are gross simplifications of what is really going on and the ways in which these systems will work out. So I'm just wondering, shouldn't this be a greater issue for STS? I mean, what about concerning traveling companions? What about surveillance studies where they are doing this kind of work? Well, okay. Thank you.
All right, so a cluster of questions. We've got about 2 minutes per panelist to respond. Should be ample time.
Who wants to go?
Well, I want to take one of the other questions that was not raised so much, but the second question on, she's sitting over there, on the media artists and other ways of thinking about the future of STS. I think I like your attempt to go to, well, your suggestion was focusing on different frameworks in terms of languages other than English. I think it would be great as well, and I see that's actually happening, and I think you are in the field of arts, and I would emphasize this now because I think it's missing in the rest of the panels as well. There are different ways of how we can communicate in terms of what I see artists do. For example, working with materials, you know, to talk about science with publics in a completely different way than we're doing it now, you know, just text and text and text, and the materiality is not there. So I think there's a lot to gain there. If we talk about traveling companions, of course it would be arts people as well, and artists. I mean, and maybe it also relates to the work Trevor Pinch is doing on sound studies with musicians. So there's much more, you know, the other senses are just not here, you know, not represented. So I think that's an important question you raised. Thank you.
Well, let me respond to a few things. David's questions about the problem of unintended consequences and feedback effects that, you know, studying race and sex can reify categories of race and sex and so on and so forth. These are things that I worry about a lot, but that I think that we do have ways of thinking about and talking about. I don't think it's a matter of trying to distinguish between, you know, top-down bad, bottom-up good, or anything of that sort. But rather, I think that, first of all, that, you know, forewarned is forearmed, and that by pointing to past histories and past instances of these kinds of unintended consequences, we do a certain kind of critical work. That's perhaps the obvious point. I do think, though, I mean, I take seriously his challenge. What can we recommend about the codification of difference into law, institutions, et cetera? You know, here I think what the conclusion of my book was really was an insistence on more difference, not less. It was an anti-universalist message about the problems of an attempt through policy to institute a heavily standardized approach to the operationalizing of difference, in which a certain set of categories would always routinely be attended to in a routine way. And then instead, I think we need to look, you know, the part of the message can be, why not look more at the differences between forms of difference? Why not look more at the differences between different cases of difference and how it intersects with health or whatever domain you happen to be looking at? I think that one of the modalities of vigilance that we, you know, SDS scholars can bring to bear through our analyses of things like standardization processes is some knowledge of how potentially to try to resist certain pernicious forms of standardization as they enter into policy. That's sort of the best I can do. In terms of an answer there, it does perhaps help explain why I'm somewhat unsympathetic to the idea of looking at deep underlying architectures, which to me just sounds too structuralist. And I am certainly interested in thinking about commonalities across domains, but I guess really not, honestly, in those particular terms. Well, you know, I'll leave that at that. I'm really glad that the point was raised about surveillance, because clearly we can't talk about difference without talking about identity, which doesn't just mean sameness, it also means identification and technologies of identification and the ways in which those are simultaneously implicated in all kinds of new difference-making practices and in the constant proliferation of new categories. So I think that's actually very much a part of you know, this broader set of concerns that we've been discussing here. Sherine?
Well, I just want to end quickly because I'm hungry. But I was just going to point for the question on attentiveness, how do we create that vigilance, and the question on codification and also on our impact on STS. I really like Anne-Marie Moll's recent book. I don't know if other people know it, The Logic of Care. And I think it's such a good model for how we can learn about how to be vigilant and attentive in places that we might not have imagined. So she takes the diabetic nurse in the diabetic ward, and what she's trying to show is that what would happen if we shift the framework in medical care from a logic of patient's choice, where, okay, patient choice was a good thing to focus on if your only other option was coercion, but it really comes from political theory, it comes from consumerism. Is it really the right framework to apply to somebody who's critically ill and extremely vulnerable? And what if we shifted that language to something like care? And what it does is that it breaks open this, the potential codification and one-size-fits-all standardization approach to people's bodies and people's illness and people's aging, to always this collaborative, always tinkering, open-ended, case-specific way of managing each person's diabetic form of illness. And then what that potential does for other questions, I think, is interesting.
Well, thank you so much. And the call to lunch is clearly loud. And I trust we haven't agreed too much on how we think about difference today, which is really so much the point. Please join me in thanking the panel.